Chapter 6. No, Sophie said eventually. Sorry? No, she repeated. You're wrong. That's not what's his name, the man we saw at the interview. Professor Vansby? Him, that's not him. Oh, but it looks... That's his great-grandfather, Sophie said firmly. Or someone like that. Just looks like him, that's all. A lot like him. Yeah, but it isn't him. Paul nodded slowly. That's all right then, he said. Because if that was him... Yes, but it wasn't. Fine. Paul stuck it back in its envelope. What should we put in the book for this one then? Sophie thought for a moment. Photograph of an old man, she said, and leave it at that. Paul nodded. A tiny part of him that was still faintly interested in sucking up to the boss suggested making that photograph of distinguished-looking middle-aged gentleman, but soon found itself shouted down by the other parts of his consciousness, who, on balance, preferred sanity to the distant hope of promotion. He attached the yellow sticky and put the envelope back on the shelf. It's 5:25, Sophie announced, with audible relief. Let's get out of here, shall we? Yes, Paul said. Let's. On the way up the stairs, they met Mr. Wormtorter coming down. Just came to remind you it's nearly going home time, he said brightly. Thanks, Paul said automatically, while Sophie gave him a carbon steel stare that he apparently didn't notice. Wouldn't do for us to go locking the doors with you two still down there, Mr. Wormtorter explained, standing aside to let them go past. Absolutely, Paul said. Nearly happened to me once, Mr. Wormtorter went on, fingering the claw on its chain around his neck. Pretty cold down there, you could catch pneumonia. He frowned and rubbed his back against the frame of the fire door. Itch, he said. Right where I can't reach. Gets me in the cold weather. He escorted them into reception, where Mr. Tanner was waiting by the door. The key was in the lock. On the inside. Paul and Sophie headed for the corridor leading to their office. Where do you two think you're going? Mr. Tanner called out. Sorry, Paul said. Just going to get our coats. Ah, Mr. Tanner frowned. Get a move on, will you? I've got better things to do than stand here all day. They scuttled down the corridor without a word and grabbed their coats. On the way back, Paul had an uneasy feeling that someone was following them, but he didn't want to make a fool of himself by stopping and looking round. Mr. Tanner didn't actually shove them out of the door, but it slammed behind them with a terrific bang. One thing I like about this job, Paul muttered as they walked away, there's never any bother about getting away on time. They reached the end of the street in silence, and then stopped. Paul always went right here, Sophie always went left. Yesterday she'd snapped, "Bye then," before darting away into the crowd, and that had been a quantum leap in sociability over the days before. But this evening they paused, as if waiting for the other to go first. Well, Sophie said, I'd better be getting home. Right, Paul said, and then... Or if you're not in a tearing hurry, we could... No, I'd better not. She gave every indication of being about to move, but didn't. Oh, Paul said. Oh, all right. There was another one of those confounded moments. Another time, maybe, she said. OK, Paul said. Tomorrow? All right. She said it without emphasis, as if he'd just asked if he could borrow her pencil sharpener. Bye. A second later she was invisible in the going home time lemming run. There was a place on the pavement next to him where she'd been standing, and an echo of her voice in his head. As simple as that, Paul said to himself. Bloody hell. On his way home, Paul stopped at a bank machine and checked his balance. The month's money had gone in. He was solvent beyond the dreams of avarice, though in his case avarice was a light sleeper. Well now, he thought. He was still thinking, well now, when he reached his door and let himself in. The sword and the stone were still there. That reminded him. He pulled off his jacket and tie, flipped the kettle on, and flopped down on the bed. It was all fine and splendid, thinking, well now, as if everything else was just background and mute music. But he'd seen and heard enough concentrated weirdness in one working day to boil his brain. If only it hadn't been addled to pulp already with all the love stuff. Professor Vansby, he thought. Yeah, what about that? Offhand, he could think of 2 explanations, the second of which was that the professor was an amazingly good judge of character who liked doing the Sherlock Holmes bit, wrapping up absurdly obvious observations in a whole load of flannel, and who looked a lot like his great-granddad. He accepted this version gratefully, like a starving fish who sees a plump worm hanging above him in the water with string coming out of the small of its back. That explained about Professor Van Spee, and if the big weirdness could be got rid of so easily, it followed that all the little weirdnesses, such as the behaviour of Messrs. Wormtoter and Tanner, the vanishing stapler, and items 19 to 31 inclusive, had to be explainable too. And if he knew they were explainable, then why should he waste his ingenuity and free time figuring out what the explanations actually were? Just knowing they were there was good enough. No point reinventing the wheel, he told himself. Then he remembered that tonight he had arranged to meet Duncan and Jenny in a pub in Museum Street. He swore. He'd arranged a meeting a month ago to celebrate the encashment of his first paycheck, and Duncan and Jenny had proved to be the only members of his narrow circle of friends who reckoned they could make it. If he'd remembered earlier, of course, he'd have stayed in town and saved himself 2 bus fares. As it was, if he was really lucky with the traffic, he might just get there no more than 20 minutes late. Duncan and Jenny would, of course, stay there until he arrived. Pity, he thought. He didn't feel in the mood for riotous living somehow. Duncan and Jenny, in Paul's opinion, summed up nearly everything that was wrong with the world. Not individually. He'd known Duncan for close on a decade. They'd built model Spitfires and discussed minutiae of Romulan uniforms together back in the days when womankind was still no more than a dark cloud on the distant horizon. While Jenny was small, lively, clever, pretty, and legitimately but not culpably blonde, and played a slick game of nomination whist, it was as a unit, a union of soul and flesh, that they got at Paul's nose to the point where their heads were all but sticking out of his ears. Duncan had met Jenny 2 years ago at a New Year's party, and ever since then they'd been tack-welded together, a fusion of 2 quite reasonable human beings into a single, nauseating entity. Paul had heard any number of horror stories about so-and-so who got himself fixed up and thereafter disappeared without trace into a black pit of soft furnishings, mortgages and early morning feeds, but regrettably that wasn't the case where Duncan and Jenny were concerned. Faster than a high-bandwidth download, Jenny had learned to play bar billiards, distinguish real ale from keg, form opinions about TV, sci-fi and football, and eat fish and chips standing on the embankment at 11:30 at night. At first Paul had assumed this was a simple protective mimicry, or, more likely, the predator merging with the shadows as it stalked her prey down the narrow, dark path that led to a serious talk about relationships and commitment. 2 years later, he was forced to the conclusion that Duncan was either blackmailing God or very, very lucky, and the whole setup was for real. Hence his feelings of profound distaste whenever he spent time with the Gestalt. It's bad enough having to watch a fellow human being enjoying unalloyed, undeserved good fortune. When the lucky bastard is a close personal friend, it's unbearable. "You're late," Duncan pointed out, when Paul finally shouldered through the door and flumped down in the seat they'd been saving for him. Paul nodded. "Ran into a distorted anti-chronoton nexus outside Tottenham Court Road Tube and got reborn as a Viking chieftain in an alternate universe. Who's rounded it?" Jenny stood up. "Mine," she said. She did things like that. It was enough to make one's teeth ache. "They've got Ventcaster 9X on, but Duncan reckons it hasn't had time to settle yet." Paul smiled weakly. "I'll have half a lager shandy, please." "Don't be silly," Jenny said, and headed for the bar, slipping between the shoulders of the massed drinkers like a golden ferret. Paul and Duncan looked at each other. "Well then," Duncan said, "what do you reckon to being all grown up then?" Paul shook his head. It'll never catch on." "You'd think so," Duncan replied. "The thing about work is it cuts into your free time. Jerked out of bed in the middle of the night and no afternoon telly. Still, lots of people swear by it." Duncan, Paul remembered, had recently been promoted to assistant deputy software wizard and was now earning more than Paul's father had been making when he'd retired. Bastard, Paul thought. "Apart from that," Duncan went on, "what's it like? I take it they haven't fired you yet." Paul grinned. They have to notice I exist first, he said. Pretty boring. Paul thought about the red eye through the letterbox and the claw mark and Professor Van Spee, and then he thought about photocopying the spreadsheets. Yes, he said. How about you? Well, Duncan said, and launched into a tirade about Microsoft, which was only abated when Jenny came back with a tray and 3 pints of murky brown beer. One good thing about the Duncan-Jenny axis was that the mere room of her approach made his old friend stop talking about computers. So, Jenny said, distributing the beer glasses, how's work? Fine, Paul muttered. Suddenly he felt he really didn't want to discuss it with anybody. Anybody else, he actually meant, let alone this insufferable pair of lovebirds. And how about you? How's showbiz? Jenny was some sort of accountant at the BBC. Don't change the subject, she said, with a twinkle in her eye that made him want to leave the building. So what's her name? Gory details. Paul couldn't be sure he'd gone bright red, as there was no mirror handy. Sorry? What are you talking about? Jenny grinned at him. Confess, I was down your way the day before yesterday, just after 1 in fact. I rang your office on my mobile to see if you were there and wanted to come out to play, but the switchboard must have been down. Nobody answered, and then I saw you marching off down the street with the mystery female. I waved, but you pretended you hadn't seen me, so then of course I knew. Paul blinked. I didn't see you, he said. It's all right, Jenny assured him. I understand. The last thing you wanted right then was another woman swooping down on you like hunting kestrels. But come on, tell us all about it. Names, places, progress reports. She's just... Oh, Jenny said, beaming. Just someone I work with, Paul muttered, scowling. That's all. Really. Sure. Jenny's grin was threatening to unzip her head at the back. Of course, I only saw the back of her head because you were in the way. Is she nice, attractive, gullible? No, Paul replied. Liar. She must be nice so you wouldn't be glowing like a nuked beetroot. It's like I've been telling you all along. You can run but you can't hide. Sooner or later there's an arrow with your name on it. Paul looked at her, and Duncan sitting next to her, silent but clearly acquiescing on this deplorable breach of good taste. And he thought, will the day come when I'll be like this? 2 of 2, subunit of Unimatrix 01, assimilated without trace into a 2-handed collective, hell-bent on infecting the entire world with his own warped vision of perfect happiness? He sighed softly. Chance be a fine thing. Sophie, he said wearily. She's the other junior clerk. She lives with her parents in Wimbledon somewhere. She's just broken up with her boyfriend, and she treats me like I'm something she trod on in the dark night. Well, she would, Duncan said reasonably. Bollocks, Jenny said daintily. If she's cooped up in the office with you all morning and then goes out to lunch with you, obviously you're onto something. The snotty thing is obviously just a front. Primeval female strategy. Take my word for it. Paul shook his head. I'm sorry, he said, but obviously in this Mills and Boone alternative universe you live in, the idea of men and women just being friends... Oh... Friends, Jenny crowed like a vampire barrister. A minute ago she couldn't stand the sight of you. This was starting to get on Paul's nerves. Unfortunately, Jenny had clearly smelt blood in the water, so changing the subject was out of the question, at least until she'd heard what she wanted to hear. Oh, all right then, he said. You're right. I really like her a lot. In fact, she's the only reason I haven't jacked the job in. Duncan sneered. That sounds more like it, he said. You just don't like working for a living. At least it was a change of subject. True, Paul admitted. But really, the whole place is as weird as a welly full of beetles. Duncan shook his head. You don't know you're born, he said. Weird as a welly full of beetles is just a synonym for of office. You've got to get used to it, that's all. For a moment, Paul seriously considered telling them all about it. The whole deal, from the bizarre interview through to the claw marks and the sword, and Gilbert and Sullivan and the eye, and the nutty stuff in the strong room, and the disappearing stapler, and Mr. Tanner going apeshit when he'd turned up 5 minutes early, right down to Professor Van Spee, his lecture and the photograph. But he decided against it, because they wouldn't believe him. Or, even worse, they might believe him, in which case there was a grave risk he might end up believing it himself. Yes, Dad, he mumbled therefore. But at least they pay me. Same again. He'd hardly touched his beer, which tasted like rotten eggs whisked in creosote, but their glasses were empty. "Ventcaster for me," Duncan said. Jenny wrinkled her nose and said she'd give the Cross Marston a try. On his way back from the bar, a pint glass in each hand and half a lemonade shandy braced between his thumbs, he reconsidered his decision. After all, it'd be great to tell someone after a month of trying to deal with it on his own. And maybe, just possibly, they'd laugh at him and call him a stupid prat and explain, because they were grown-ups, big people who knew about the world, and they might be able to point out the screamingly obvious explanation which everybody else in the universe knew about except him. At the very least, they'd say he was out of his tree and had imagined the whole thing, and they could be very convincing when they wanted to be. He'd like to believe he'd imagined the whole thing. It would be a comfort. Yes, but he hadn't. "This one's the Ventcaster," he said, apportioning the glasses. "Fancy game of cards?" So they played nomination whist for 2 hours, Duncan winning one game and Jenny all the rest. And if Jenny couldn't resist pointing out that Paul was obviously in love, because only someone whose brain was addled with sweet longings could have bid 3 on a heap of shit like that, and if Duncan and Jenny kept pausing at crucial moments to rub noses and nibble each other's faces, still, it was wonderfully refreshing to be doing something normal again, like playing cards in a pub with an old friend, or an old friend and his fiend-like queen, which amounted to the same thing. 3 halves and a pint of lemonade shandy helped, of course, though in the back of his mind he knew he was going to regret that aspect of the evening's entertainment come 7 o'clock next morning. Furthermore, he couldn't help noticing a slight change in their attitude towards him, a small but palpable upwards reassessment of his status. He'd gone from being poor, funny Paul, who still hadn't got a job or a girlfriend, to a lowly junior apprentice with a mighty enterprise of Life Incorporated still out of sight, below themselves, of course, but part of the same outfit, one of us rather than a homeless refugee from childhood. But it occurred to him, while they were playing cards, and later while they were gorging themselves on greasy battered cod in the embankment, and later still as he was juggled dyspeptically homewards on the night bus, and that there was something wrong with this picture. And after a certain amount of savagely honest introspection, he figured out what it was. That he was in love, there could be no possible doubt. The strange yet all too familiar feeling, something like a hangover, something like acute car sickness, that he felt every time he saw her, confirmed that. But then he compared 2 mental images, one of the evening he'd just spent, and one of an imaginary evening out with Sophie. All brittle silences, minefields, and measureless caverns of ice. And then he asked himself the appalling question, just what do you see in her? It wasn't a question he'd even considered asking himself before. She was a girl, unattached, and she'd held still for more than 5 minutes without walking away or smacking him round the face. That was enough. What mattered was the other side of the coin. What could she possibly ever see in him? Yes, but, he asked himself, yes, but pigeonholing that for just a second, answer the question, why do you love this girl? And he thought about it. And the more he thought, the more he realised that the only answer was that the good old mountaineers stand by. Because she's there. Because she might possibly like me. Because she hadn't said she can't stand the sight of me yet. Bad answer, he thought. Because if his dreams came true, if he uncorked a super whizzo hyper genie and got his one wish, there wouldn't be any cosy, cheerful, relaxed evenings in pubs playing nomination whist. None of this decadent, self-indulgent being himself nonsense. He suddenly remembered something she'd said. On Gilbert and Sullivan night. On the exotic Rialto of Highgate. Neither of us was being ourselves, so we could never really be us. While afar off in the distance, like the faint horns of Elfland, the ghost of Groucho Marx whispered its famous line about not wanting to belong to a club that have someone like him as a member. But, he assured himself, but that was so much beside the point that it was practically coming out round the back of it. Where the hell was the point in speculating about whether you wanted true happiness when you stood about as much chance of getting it as Geoffrey Archer had of winning the Booker Prize? Besides, if true happiness was no more than this, playing cards and drinking shandy in a pub with two degenerates, then he couldn't help thinking that the fish who had crawled on their fins out of the primeval oceans to follow the long, hard trail of evolving into him had probably been wasting their time. He considered the pursuit of happiness, and above all it reminded him of the relentless, futile persecution of Bugs Bunny by Elmer Fudd. At least, he thought, as he unlocked his door and flipped the light switch and saw the light bounce back at him off the blade of the sword in the stone, at least it helps me keep all of this shit in perspective. Life at J.W.Wells & Co. might be deeply weird, but it was peanuts compared with the fathomless craziness of being human. Now, if he'd tried to explain that to a couple of old friends, they wouldn't have laughed in his face. They'd have held him down till the ambulance arrived with the handcuffs and the jacket that did up in the back. Next morning, Paul had a headache. Unfair, he thought. Duncan and Jenny had been swilling the stuff down in pailfuls, but you could bet next year's rent they weren't feeling as though Tennessee hillbillies were dynamiting trout in the murky green pools behind their eyes. Nor would they be afflicted with heartburn, indigestion, and severe flatulence. He hacked 2 ragged slices off the stub of his stale loaf and crammed them clumsily into the toaster. Then, purely from habit, he fumbled the radio on. "It's 7:30, the radio yelled at him, "and here's the news." His mind tuned out instinctively. He didn't want to know about the latest political crisis, or the latest god-awful little war, or the latest unspeakable murder. Callous and irresponsible of him, maybe, but none of it was his fault, and he'd rather it left him alone and spoilt someone else's breakfast. He scraped rock-hard butter over his brittle toast, while the radio burbled excitedly about further rises in inflation, escalating tension in the Balkans, floods in Minnesota, and drought in Somalia, corruption, lies, famine, war, pestilence and death, plagues of rats in the tunnels of the Bakerloo line, urban foxes spreading mange through the lush kennels of Surrey, and the 12th reported sighting of goblins in the sewers under the City of London. The traffic on the way to work was in a playful mood. For some reason, it wasn't where it usually was, which meant that he arrived in Houndsditch at 20 minutes to 9, 17 minutes earlier than usual. He knew better than to head into the office, so he limped into a cafe sort of place, bought himself a cup of tea, and sat down. An earlier occupant of his seat had left a chunk of his newspaper behind, but it was just the business pages. Paul didn't bother picking it up, but over the rim of his teacup he caught sight of a headline. "Major new Australian bauxite finds threaten commodity prices." He put his cup down and picked up the paper. Apparently, some busy little bee had found vast new deposits of bauxite in the Australian desert, which meant that pretty soon you wouldn't be able to give the stuff away, and it was costing the mining cartels untold billions. Bauxite, he thought, and he carefully tore out the page and folded it away in his pocket. Then he finished his tea and went to work. His head was slightly better, but not much. All in all, he felt like a slug in a salt cellar. The receptionist greeted him with a cheerful chirrup that made his teeth ache. He mumbled some sort of a reply and then shuffled up the stairs to his office. Empty. And then he remembered that he was on strong room sorting duty, and he hadn't brought his scruffy pulley. He hung his coat behind the door, no scratch marks, and went back down the stairs, feeling every step distinctly. "Hello," Sophie called out as he opened the door, and the cold hit him like a slap with a wet fish. "God, you look awful." He nodded. I'm not feeling all that great," he admitted. "You should have stayed in bed." Paul shrugged. "Oh, I thought I'd better come in." "Suit yourself. Right, let's get started then." There's this to be said for being hungover. If you've got a job to do that involves substantial levels of ambient weirdness, it helps, because you can't be bothered to notice stuff that under other circumstances would come close to frying your synapses. Treasure maps, Tsarist bonds, a case of stuffed dodos, Scarlett O'Hara's birth certificate, 2 flattened and deformed silver bullet heads in an old matchbox, Baedeker's Guide to Atlantis, 17th edition, 1902, the autographed score of Schubert's Unfinished Symphony, with Das End written neatly at the foot of the last page. 3 boxes of moon rocks, a dumpy, heavy statuette of a bird covered in dull black paint, which reminded him of something, but he couldn't quite remember what. A Norwich Union life policy in the name of Vlad Dracul, a cigar box full of oddly shaped teeth, with "Caution, do not drop" painted on the lid in hysterical capitals, 5 or 6 dolls' house-sized books with titles like Lilliput on $2 a day, a small slab of green crystal that glowed when he opened the envelope, a thick bundle of love letters bound in blue ribbon, all signed Margaret Roberts, a left luggage token from the North Central Railway terminus, Ruritania, Bartholomew's Road Atlas of Oz, 1 page with a yellow line smack down the middle, a brown paper bag of solid gold jelly babies, several contracts for the sale and purchase of souls, a fat brown envelope inscribed "To be opened on my death, E. A. Presley," unopened, Oxford and Cambridge Board O-level papers in Elvish language and literature, 1969 to 1985. A very old drum in a worm-eaten sea chest marked F. Drake, Plymouth, in with a load of minute books and annual accounts of the Winchester Round Table. 6 incredibly ugly portraits of major Hollywood film stars. Unicorn Calling for Pleasure and Profit by J.R. Hartley. A huge collection of betting slips on races to be held in the year 2109. All water as far as Paul was concerned, off a duck's back. "Bloody hell," he said. Sophie looked up. "What?" "Come over here." He flipped back the lid of the long wooden box so that she could see what was inside. They both studied it in silence for a moment or so. "Yes, it's pretty much the same as mine," Sophie said eventually. "Only the wire binding on the handle of mine is a sort of dull grey." Paul knelt down for a closer look. "No, mine's the same colour as this one," he said. "Like that brass wire you buy for hanging pictures from. I think on mine... What's that round bit on the end called?" "Pommel." "The pommel on mine might be a tad smaller, but I can't be sure. That aside, though, I'd say it's pretty well identical. Except," he added, "it's missing the chunk of stone on the end." He stood up, still gazing at the sword on the box. "Take a look in the old register," he said. 776/J. Sophie leafed through the big red book for a minute or so. "It just says Windsor," she said. "Oh, well," Paul replied. He closed the lid and shoved the box back into its dark corner. He noticed that he'd forgotten about his headache, but noticing made it come back. 5-1, Sophie announced. "Ah, all right." It was another moment. "Do you fancy—" "I'd better be going," Sophie said. "I'm meeting my mum for lunch at 5 past. "Oh," Paul said. "Right. See you later then." As it happened, he really didn't mind too much, what with the headache and the anguished bowels and everything. The last thing he wanted, he realised, was food of any description, while trying to make impressively light, brilliant conversation was plainly beyond him. In fact, he couldn't really be bothered to move from where he was. It was pleasantly cool down there and quiet, and he couldn't face the stairs. He sat down on the trunk, leaned his back against the shelves, and closed his eyes. When Paul woke up, his watch told him it was 1:20, and he felt considerably better. The dwarfs had stopped drilling out the back of his head, and his eyes didn't hurt quite so much. He still had a stomach like a car battery, but he could live with that, as long as he avoided putting anything in it. He stood up and looked around. They weren't getting on too badly, he realised. Another day and a half, 2 days, and they ought to be through here. It occurred to him that since he had nothing better to do, he might as well press on and do a bit more on his own. He had the feeling she'd approve of that, though he wasn't sure why. The first box he opened contained something that he took at first to be a pillowcase, except that it was made of a sort of thin, rubbery stuff. He had no idea what it was, but it wasn't cloth. There was no number or anything on the box, so he spread the thing out on the floor. That left him none the wiser. It was rectangular, and printed on it was the crude outline of a door, with panels, hinges, and a little circle for a doorknob. He shrugged, folded it up, and put it back, with its very own yellow sticky. In the notebook he wrote down "rubber mat," and then, since he was feeling just a tad flippant, he rubbed that out with the rubber on the end of the pencil and wrote "an Acme portable door." But that looked silly, So he rubbed it out again and changed it to rectangular flat rubber object and left it at that. Next item was an envelope full of blank sheets of paper. He checked the number in the old red book, but it wasn't there. Fine, he said to himself. Be like that. Next item was another bundle of letters, ancient envelopes with Victorian stamps, bound in faded red ribbon. The ink was brown with age, and the handwriting was cramped and scruffy, and it hurt his eyes to read it. So he checked the reference number against the red book, 839-N to 839-N. 17 love letters, property of Paul Carpenter, Esquire. He looked at the page. Bloody hell, he thought. There's a coincidence. But the ink in the register was almost as brown as the writing on the letters themselves, and the date for when they'd been booked in was 1877. He shrugged and started copying the details into the notebook. He'd written down the first 2 lines of the address before he noticed it was his own. Fuck this for a game of soldiers, he told himself. The pink ribbon was tightly knotted, and he broke a fingernail untying it. He took the first letter out of the envelope and looked at the date. 3 weeks ago. Paul closed his eyes and then opened them again. Still 3 weeks ago. Shit. Not fair, he shouted to himself. All I had was 2.5 pints of rotten lemonade shandy. That's not enough, surely. Bet Duncan and bloody Jenny didn't go around. Hang about. What sort of letters? He looked back at the register and read the relevant adjective carefully 4 times. Whoever had written the red book, they had clear, precise handwriting. Not lawn letters, or law letters, or low letters, or loo letters, or loy letters. Put the register down carefully and frowned. Well, he thought, can't do any harm. He lied to himself. He laid the first letter flat on the nearest shelf and started to read. My darling Paul. He paused and stared. Whoever had written this letter, he or she had the worst writing ever perpetuated outside of a doctor's surgery. He squinted at it, but it defied his best efforts. Then he thought of something and reached out for the spiral-bound notebook in which Sophie had been writing down the inventory. No doubt about it. Same writing. Jesus, he thought. He picked up the letter and carried it across the room until he was standing directly under the single, unshaded light bulb. My darling Paul, ever since we met this morning, I haven't been able to get you out of my mind. All I can do is think about you, the way you looked at me, the sound of your voice. I thought I'd never see you again, and suddenly there you were, like you'd stepped out of my daydream. I love you so much, I can't think about anything else. I can't concentrate on work or anything like that. Oh, you've guessed, haven't you? You must have done. I sit there with that pile of ridiculous spreadsheets in front of me, desperately trying not to look at you across the desk from me, and the last thing in the world I want is to think about is shuffling bits of paper. I want to feel the soft warmth of your lips on mine, the burning thrill as your fingers... Bloody hell, Paul muttered. You must know how I feel about you, he read. I can read it in your eyes every time you look at me, and I'm absolutely sure you feel the same way about me. So why don't you say something? You can't be afraid, not when I'm sitting next to you, burning to death with... However hard he tried, he couldn't make that word out. Might possibly be dessert or dishcloth, but he didn't think so. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you don't care and I'm making a complete idiot of myself. I don't care. I've never felt like this about anyone before. Definitely not that clown Nigel with his stupid amateur dramatics, which is all he seems to care about at the moment. Oh, Paul, please say something quickly. I can't bear the suspense any longer. I know... Footsteps outside the door. Faster than a rat up a conduit. Paul grabbed the letters and stuffed them back on the shelf as the door opened and Sophie walked in. Hello, she said. You still here? Paul knew he must be glowing like a stop sign. Mm-hmm, he mumbled. Didn't feel like any lunch. Thought I'd do a bit more. She frowned at him. You're pretty keen all of a sudden, she said. All right, where have you got to? Well... Actually, I haven't got terribly far. She came over and flicked through the notebook. 2 entries, she said. No, you haven't, have you? He couldn't think of anything to say. He shrugged. Well, she sighed, we'd better get on with it. What's next? He pulled down a deed box and opened it. How was your mother, by the way? He asked. Mum, oh, pretty much the same as when I saw her at breakfast this morning, she replied. Why? Oh, no reason. Sorry, right. Well, it looks like a big wodge of premium bonds. She was writing in the notebook. Okay, she said. Any name or anything? He rummaged around in the bottom of the box and found a slip of paper. £5,000 nominal value. Property of Mr. Paul Carpenter. He shut his eyes tight and then opened them again. Nope, he replied. Marvellous, Sophie sighed. All right, slap a yellow sticky on and we'll see what's next. The next envelope held a sheaf of share certificates. Paul didn't know much about high finance, but even he knew that 20,000 ordinary shares in Kawaguchi Integrated Circuits Incorporated had to be worth a lot of money. Interesting, since apparently they belonged to him. Share certificates, he said. Property of, Paul, Smith. Fine, she said, as he attached a yellow sticky and shoved them hastily back on the shelf. Next. The further he went on, the harder he found it to keep going. $50,000 in travellers' cheques, $35,000 in national savings certificates, the deeds to 2 semi-detached houses in Ewell. This Paul Smith sounds like he's loaded, Sophie commented. All right, got that. She looked up. Do you want to swap over for a bit? He dropped the deed packet. Oh, no, that's fine, he said. If you don't mind, I'm quite happy doing this. You sure? You're getting covered in dust. Oh, that's all right, really. She shrugged. Please yourself. All right, what's next? He groped for the next envelope. Paul Smith again, he said in a rather hoarse voice. Post office savings book. 4,000 quid. He can't be very bright, this Smith bloke. He'd get much better interest in a building society or something. Well, she added, tapping the notebook impatiently. What's next? More of this Smith character's ill-gotten gains? Actually, Paul said in a very quiet voice, I don't think it did him much good. Really? Why? Paul folded a piece of paper and put it back in its envelope. Well, that was his death certificate, he muttered. Oh, well, never mind. I was starting to dislike him anyway. Yeah, me too, Paul said. I can't help feeling sorry for him, though. Why's that? He died young, Paul replied. Not much older than me, as it happens. 4 months, 2 weeks, 3 days, to be precise. But he didn't say anything about that, nor did he mention the cause of death. That's sad, Sophie said. I suppose. Anyway, none of our business. I'm going for a pee. As soon as she was out of the door, Paul sprang across the room and started searching for the bundle of letters he'd hidden away when she came back from lunch. They didn't seem to want to be found, and he was just beginning to think he'd imagined the whole thing when they turned up, wedged in the crevasse between 2 fat manila folders. He glanced down at them. My darling Paul. Yes, still there. He crammed them in his jacket pocket. Then, not really wanting to one little bit, he fished out the last item with the yellow sticky on it. Death certificate. Paul Carpenter. Date and place of birth, address and cause of death. Decapitation, he thought. Bloody hell. It was a very long afternoon. Anyway, Sophie said, as they walked out through reception at 5:29, we're getting there. If we really crack on with it tomorrow, I think we might get it finished. Paul nodded. He wasn't really listening. Out through the door, she was telling him how she couldn't wait to get back to their rotten little office after 3 days in that horrible, cold strong room. They reached the corner, her that way, him this. She stopped. Well, she said. Paul looked up. He'd been staring at his shoes. Sorry? A second dragged by. An oak tree could have grown in that second. Paul had the feeling she was waiting for something, but his mind was elsewhere. Decapitation, he was thinking. For fuck's sake, and 70 grand in the Abbey National, Chelmsford. I've never been to bloody Chelmsford. And then he realised that she was looking at him, and for some reason she was furiously angry. Well, see you tomorrow, she snapped, and walked away very quickly. A better man, or at least a biped with one working brain cell, would have chased after her. But Paul didn't. He shook his head and trudged to the bus stop. Australia, he was thinking. No, not Australia. That's where they'd found all that fucking bauxite. Ontario. Surely if he went there he'd be safe, and they'd never follow him all that way. Would they? Besides, who are they, anyhow? My darling Paul. He made a decision. What he needed, he decided, was a drink. Something fierce and strong and vicious, with teeth and claws, and possibly a cube of ice and a slice of lemon. He drifted across the road to a pub, only remembering as he sat down with his drink that on the last occasion he'd been there, she'd been sitting over by the door with her pint of Guinness. A large bald man with a thick neck was in her place now. That didn't seem right somehow. It was like removing a statue of Eros from the Piccadilly Circus and replacing it with a 10-foot plastic Mickey Mouse. This being no time for faint hearts or false economies, he ordered a full pint of lemonade shandy and sat down in a corner where nobody was likely to tread on his feet and break his concentration. Are we sitting comfortably? Then we'll begin. The letters. He took them out, patted the spilled beer off the tabletop with his sleeve, and put them carefully down. Next, he picked out the one he'd started to read earlier and opened it. My dear Philip. He blinked 3 times and looked at the envelope. It was addressed, quite clearly in sharp, slanting handwriting, to Lieutenant Philip Catherwood, the parsonage, Norton St. Edgar, Worcestershire. The postmark was 22nd of April, 1877. Fuck, he thought. He checked the rest of the letters, all addressed to the same person, in the same handwriting, dating from 22nd of April 1877 through to 12th of January 1879, by which time Lieutenant Catherwood was serving in South Africa. Paul stopped there. He'd spent most of his history lessons at school drawing sheep in the margins of his textbooks, but he'd seen Zulu 3 times and read articles about the Zulu War in his military modelling magazines. 22nd of January 1879. British Army wiped out at Isandlwana. Somehow he knew exactly what had happened to Philip Catherwood. Terribly sad, but that wasn't the point. At least he'd had someone writing love letters to him. He checked. He felt awful about reading them, and he only flicked through. He was shocked. He had no idea they did stuff like that back in the 1870s, and especially an officer and a gentleman. Put the letters away quickly and hoped nobody had seen him reading them. Think, he ordered himself. Implications. If the love letters that had been addressed to him a few hours previously were now somebody else's, wasn't there a decent chance that the rest of the stuff, all that money, and of course the death certificate, maybe all that stuff was somebody else's too? He shunted his consciousness into serious mode and considered the alternatives. He was hungover, residual alcohol slushing through his veins like the Severn Bore, and he'd imagined the whole thing. He was cracking up, and it was starting to get embarrassingly obvious. In his haste, he'd grabbed the wrong bundle of letters, and the Dear Paul stuff was still wedged in the rack in the strong room. The letters had been written to him when he first looked at them, but now they weren't. The letters were written to him as long as he was inside the doors of 70 St. Mary Axe, but as soon as he stepped over the threshold, they morphed into a slice of tragic Victoriana. The letters were written to him, but on his way out through reception, someone had picked his pocket and replaced them with 15 instalments of forged 19th century soft porn. She had written the letters, but never posted them. Instead, she'd stashed them in J.W.Wells' safe, and when she saw they'd gone, she'd guessed he'd found them, surreptitiously swiped them, and replaced them with something vaguely similar she'd found on the shelves, to make him believe he'd imagined the whole thing. Paul reviewed these alternatives and decided that, on balance, it'd be better for his mental health to quit speculating and wait until tomorrow, when he'd have a chance to look at all the other stuff. If the bank books and house deeds and death certificate were all still there, that would at least allow him to run a blue pencil through some of the alternatives. Another explanation: the air in the strong room was laced with some form of hallucinogenic compound, possibly sewer gas escaping from the building's medieval plumbing. And he'd imagined the stuff with the letters because he'd been as high as the rate of inflation at the time he'd been down there. Was as plausible as several of the others and about as much help. He glugged another mouthful of shandy, and the fizz went up his nose, making him sneeze. It wasn't any good, he told himself, focusing on these damned letters, or the money, or even the death certificate. What he needed to do was address the whole issue of weirdness, which he'd been shying away from for just over a month, partly because he was a coward, but mostly because he was in love. Weirdness, he thought. Swords and bauxite and men with dragon's claws on chains round their necks, buying him lunch at cosy little Uzbek restaurants. One of the aspects of the human condition that elevates mankind above the lesser primates is the inquiring mind, the urge to find out, to know the essential truth. But there has to come a time when the inquiring mind stops inquiring, finds a late-night travel agency and books a one-way flight to Canada. Another aspect, of course, is romantic love. Something that Paul had always reckoned God slipped into the design schematics late on day 8, while rubbing his hands together and sniggering. If I quit at J.W.Wells, I may never see her again. Of all the bloody stupid arguments, and yet it was the only one that mattered. Hell, he thought. Yes, he said to himself, but the death certificate. And then he put his beer glass down and stared at the darkened window opposite, because he'd suddenly remembered the date on the certificate, the day and month on which he was due to be beheaded. 22nd of January. Oink, he thought. Calm down, he thought. In fact, that made perfect sense, because if he'd been imagining things and letters belonged to the late Philip Catherwood, wasn't it likely, or at least possible, that all the other items were Catherwood papers too, and the form his delusions had taken was simply reading his own name every time he saw that of the poor dead subaltern? In which case, assuming he was right about Philip meeting his death in the shadow of the Horned Mountain, then of course the date would have been 22nd of January. 22nd of January, 1879, the day of the battle. Actually, it was probably even simpler than that. It was dark in the strong room, right? And the handwriting, well, he could read it all right here in a well-lit pub, but down there, with a hangover and under a single 60-watt bulb, wasn't it at least conceivable that he'd misread Philip Catherwood as Paul Carpenter and mucked the dates up as well? He could feel clenched muscles relaxing all over his body. Of course, he realised, that was all there was to it. Easy enough to figure out how it happened. The booze, of course, and the cold, and a certain degree of mental imbalance caused by his addled love for the thin girl, combined with his vivid imagination making mountains out of the molehills of minor weirdness he'd experienced over last month. And as for them, he was absolutely confident he'd be able to explain them all, given time and a few extra brain cells. The claw mark, for instance. So one of the cleaners had a large, boisterous Alsatian, which for some reason she brought to work with her one day, and it got off the lead and it scratched some paint. Big deal. The bauxite. Well, maybe he had actually doused or scried it. There were little men with hazel twigs who did it for a living. He'd seen TV programmes about it. Or else it was just coincidence, exaggerated by his overheated imagination. The round, red eye through the letterbox. That Alsatian again. Or Mr. Tanner, temporarily bloodshot after smoking a cigar right down to the last knockings of the stub. That really only left the sword in the stone, and he'd been through that all already. In short, there was a simple explanation for every single thing. Probably it was all just something to do with J.W.Wells trying to fiddle its tax bill. Practically anything in the world becomes suddenly credible if you tag the magic words, doing it for tax reasons, on the end. He finished his drink and stood up. All that panic and fuss over a silly misunderstanding. In which case, Paul asked himself as he sat on the bus, what about me and Sophie? Well, now, there was no more weirdness to worry about. There was no more reason to quit the job. So that was all right. But if there was no weirdness, then... He frowned so ferociously that the woman sitting next to him got up and moved to the back of the bus. If there was no weirdness, then by implication, all that stuff that Professor Van Spee had told him was just guesses, from someone who fancied himself as a bit of a Sherlock Holmes, and accordingly unreliable at best, most likely worthless. A similar line of argument could be used to dispose of the Gilbert and Sullivan thing, in which case you probably didn't love him after all. Oh, he thought. For crying out loud, he told himself, life wasn't like that. Your cake to have and to eat from this day forward, in weirdness and in health. You couldn't decide to keep the nice bits off the crazy stuff and then take the rest of it back to the shop for a refund. Anyway, wasn't it better to be living in a universe where things worked like they were meant to, where claw marks were made by big dogs, hungover idiots misread old faded letters in dark rooms, good-natured employers took new trainees out to lunch on their first day, and girls didn't fall in love with pathetic wimps with no redeeming features whatsoever? Well, yes, he said to himself, of course, naturally, I suppose. But then he remembered something that had been lurking at the back of his mind. It can't be too bad, he told himself, and if he was smirking a little, so what? There was nobody to see. She can't absolutely hate the sight of me, or she wouldn't have agreed to go out with me tonight. Pause, rewind, delete smirk. Shit! Well, at least that explained why she stomped off in a huff when they'd passed outside the office door. She, against all the odds, she had actually said yes when he'd asked her out, thereby giving him an option on being the happiest man on earth and having all of his dreams come true. Choirs of angels were waiting in the wings, blue skies were lurking at the edges of clouds all over the Western Hemisphere, Berkeley Square was knee-deep in nightingales practising scales and arpeggios, and he'd forgotten. A stupid, trivial little thing like the fear of death had been enough to flush it out of his mind. And now, here he was, conclusively and comprehensively stuffed in perpetuity. Idiot. Teabag memory. Of all the bloody stupid things. It was raining when Paul got off the bus, and his coat was back in St Mary Axe. He pulled his jacket lapels around his face, like he'd seen them do in the movies, but it didn't do any good at all. The hallway of the house was pitch dark. The bulb had gone, and nobody could be buggered to replace it. He was wet through, and his suit smelt of rain. He opened the door of his bedsit, groped for the light switch, and stumbled in. No light switch. Either that or some clown had moved it. But people don't break into houses and move the electric fittings around, or at any rate, not in Kentish town. Feeling annoyed and stupid, he stood in the doorway, pawing at the wall, but he couldn't seem to locate the bloody thing. For a moment, he wondered if he'd blunted in someone else's room by mistake. But that wasn't possible. He could distinctly remember unlocking the door, and here was his keyring still in his hand. But still, he couldn't find the goddamn light switch. Nothing for it. On the mantelpiece, he knew for a fact, right in the middle between the 2p coin jar and the petrol station carriage clock his parents had given him for his 18th birthday, there was a candle. He lit it occasionally for ambience, though it generally went out after 30 seconds or so. Next to it, there should be a box of matches for lighting a gas fire. He headed for it, remembering to sidestep where the sword and the stones should be, and traced the wall with his fingertips. Sure enough, mantelpiece, candle, matches, precisely where he'd left them. He struck a match and lit the candle. Oh, he thought. It wasn't his room. Well, it was the same room he lived in, because this was his candle. There was the stupid bloody sword. There were the window and the bed. There was the table. There was the damp patch on the wall that looked like a map of Turkey drawn by Salvador Dali. But it wasn't his room. He thought about it, and about various other things, including several stately homes he'd been taken to as a child, picture postcards from the Victorian Albert Museum, and various bits of the Antiques Roadshow he'd sat through at various times, waiting for Star Trek Voyager to come on. It was, he decided, the way the room he lived in would probably have looked 100 or so years ago. Fuck this, he thought, and turned around, heading for the door, which wasn't there anymore.